in my generation, I'm 43. It's sort of, in a way, I feel like almost worse. It's like, you must have children, you must have career success, and also you should work out and do this and do that and be happy, and make me time.
Where were you stuck in traffic in New York?
Yeah, but it was like, the thing is, the days that I don't podcast I get completely, just for toots. So I went downtown and I thought I'd be right back. And then I was like on, one street for and I kept writing to your assistant, having an anxiety attack. Or producer. So anyway, I'm sorry.
No, you're totally good. I flew on Monday and my plane was 5.5 hours delayed. And it took all of my self-control not to utterly lose my mind.
I mean, it's like one of those things with flying where it's like, it's miraculous. Like, it's a miracle, right? You can get into the sky and go places that humans haven't been able to go but in the same sense, when it goes wrong, you're like, wow, I'm 5 hours late.
Well, it challenges you because it's totally outside your control, but it feels insane to have zero emotion about it, right? So you feel stressed or rushed, even though it's a totally impotent, torturing emotion, but it feels weird to just be like, all right, I'll see you in 5.5 hours later than I expected. But that's really all you can do.
Right. I also think the thing when people get mad at the airline staff, you're like, what are they going to do? You want them to take off with the plane, with the mechanic down there, fixing, what is, you want them to fly into the back, how would you want this to play out that would be better for you?
Yeah, although the flight that I was delayed on, it was I woke up and it was delayed 2 hours and I saw it before I left. I'd still had to wake up at 5 a.m., right? But it was helpful that I learned 2 hours. Right. But then it was delayed another 2 hours, and then it was delayed another hour and a half or whatever. Obviously, if they told me it was 5.5 hours up front, I would have been totally fine, right?
Right.
I could have made plans. I think part of it's the injustice of the way you're being treated, I think is what we're responding to. Do you know what I mean?
No.
That they're not being straight with you, that you can't plan around it. There is a part of it that mimics, I think, a healthy thing, which is don't let people treat you like shit. And when you're being treated like shit, it's hard to just take it.
Right. I mean, but I do also think they don't care.
Yeah, of course.
One of my favorite bits of video is Ted Cruz screaming at the airport attendants.
Yes. Do you know who I am? If you ever find yourself thinking those words, you have so lost the plot.
Yes. Oh, it's so, I mean, I would even go I'm sober a long time. And they used to, some of the meetings that I've gone to where they've said, when you need to talk to the manager, when you ask to talk to the manager, you're in trouble. That's the moment where things have really gone off the rails.
Well, that's where the higher power thing comes in. You don't have to accept a specific higher power and you could just say the words. But I think the critical thing is realizing that you are not in charge. That's, I think, the wisdom of that idea. It's you're not in charge. And in fact, the people who are in charge don't care about you at all. And the sooner you accept this, the less distress you will feel going through the world.
It's true. Well, I would also say, I don't even know that it's not that they don't care about you. It's that they're not thinking about you.
Yeah, they're indifferent to you.
Right. And I think it's this idea, I mean, the single most helpful thing I have ever heard, and it's been so true in so many relationships in my life, is that they're just doing it, right? It's it's an Al-Anon thing. They're not doing it to you, they're just doing it. And if you're in their way, and I'll have moments, especially in the last 10 years, where I will think to myself, this person is acting out something they need to act out, and I am in their way.
Yeah.
And that is very, I mean, I once had someone we're focusing on mental health issues here, right? This is what this, okay, good. All right, just checking. I don't want to talk about politics. I was on a sports podcast earlier today. So, I mean, luckily they didn't ask me about sports, but so I had someone try to make amends to me. And she started telling me about how she'd always hated me and had been gossiping about me and saying all these terrible things. And I thought to myself, like, this is what this woman has to say. Like, and the most sober thing I can do is just say thank you, and not say this is an insane thing to say to someone. Yeah.
Yes, that you're actually hurting me by apologizing, but you're understanding that they're doing it for them and they don't have that much free will over it helps you not take it personally and just see it as an event.
I thought it said a lot more about them than it did about me.
Yeah, there's a Stoic line that it's not things that upset us, it's our opinion about things. So like you're saying, they're just doing it. It's just happening. You're telling yourself that this is unfair, that this is cruel, that it's selfish, whatever. You're putting these labels on it. Right. And those labels are the source of your distress or pain or frustration.
Yeah, I mean, I would also even, I might take it a step further, which is that over-personalizing and bringing the ego into it is what really gets people, I think, is what causes the most hurt.
Well, you wrote a piece at the beginning of the pandemic that I liked that was about how sobriety prepared you for what was to come. How did that work?
So, because I mean, it's an interesting thing because I'm sober a long time, but I also struggle from really bad sort of generational anxiety, right? Likewise. I have stories of my in my mind, I can think of like my grandfather having anxiety attacks. Like it's not even like on both sides, like one of my grandfather, Howard Fast, who was this writer who was communist and who was blacklisted and who went to jail. He had these terrible cluster headaches. So he had tanks of oxygen in his closet. So, there's like a very, so I would say that part of, this tenet in AA is the idea that you stay in the moment and you don't get too far ahead of yourself. And so with this pandemic, I mean, certainly the way I felt about the pandemic in February 2020 was wildly different than the way I felt about it in July 2020, and wildly different than the way I felt about it in December 2021. And so I would say like that idea of just, you just like staying in one moment at a time and not trying to figure out, what this would look like in 6 months or in a year or in a year and a half. And I think that has really served me.
Back in the ancient world, philosophy wasn't abstract, it wasn't theoretical, it was designed to help you live the best life. In Stoicism 101, we have a 2-week course that will introduce you into philosophy that will make you a better person. There's interviews with me, daily lessons that will challenge you to be better, give you new ways of thinking, tackling the problems of life, becoming your best self. As Marcus Aurelius says, you could be good today, but instead you choose tomorrow. Epictetus says, how much longer are you going to wait to demand the best for yourself? Check out our new course, Stoicism 101 at dailystoic.com/101. Yeah, there was, I think if you could, the closer you could get to an attitude during the pandemic that was just sort of like, buckle up, it's going where it's going. The easier time you were going to have. It's the sort of fighting it or the denying it, which is sort of two different sort of approaches that a lot of people took. That's what I feel like got people in trouble.
Well, and I also think like there was a moment, and I have a grandfather who lived through the 1918 pandemic, my grandfather on my mother's side. So there was a moment where we didn't know if this would be the 1918 pandemic. And the 1918 pandemic was, they just, it killed, 12-year-olds and 20-year-olds, and the healthiest people died. And I think that would have been significantly, I have actually spent a lot of time thinking that would have been significantly more traumatic than what happened, because even though it was crushing, and we lost 1 million people, and there are people who will be sick forever from it, and maybe, there was a sense in which it wasn't as destabilizing, the idea that it went after people who were already in less good health. Now, that doesn't make it okay in any stretch of the imagination, and in fact, morally, I think we Americans went to a worse place because there was a lot of like, well, grandma's got to go anyway. Grandma's going to go in 10 years or 20 years, which is that kind of, once you get into like, and actually when I wrote this piece recently about teenagers in this post-pandemic age, they have seen us as a culture make a moral calculus about the value of human life. If you don't think that's going to breed a generation of nihilists,
or I think there already is a generation of nihilists. I think the problem is that it's breeding a generation of cynics, which is in a sense worse, right? And I actually struggle with this with my parents. My parents are boomers, to watch them betray all the things that they said were important to me growing up as different things happened in the world, and it was no longer expedient to care about those things because now their retirement portfolio or their just day-to-day comfort in like discourse or conversation was threatened, to toss that out the window to go with something that to have to stick with what they like. I think we haven't yet discussed the generational trauma and consequences of that.
Right. And I think that boomers, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, I hope you don't use this as the pull quote for the interview. Boomers are going to, they're a huge generation. They're going to live longer than anyone else in history. I mean, maybe they won't live quite as long because of the pandemic and the life expectancy has gone down in America, but they're going to live a long time. And they're going to have had a very, very a quality of life that the generations after them will not have had.
Yeah,
because we have these quality of life. So they're set up for a fair amount of resentment already.
Yeah.
And I think that will continue likely. And that generation is just starting to be elderly. They're just hitting 80.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to be strange. Well, I was thinking about you because I just read this book, Baby on the Fire Escape. Have you read it?
No.
It's about like creative women in the 20th century and their struggle to be parents. So it's about like Susan Sontag and Doris Lessing and all these writers, mostly writers, although there's some sculptors, but the artists that we sort of know that were sort of freed by the sexual revolution in some way, and then still fighting against, still having to navigate that in their own way. I thought it was really interesting because I know obviously your mom is a writer a little bit later than them, but it was just really interesting to read, just because the history of the creative arts is so often male, to sort of read about these women struggling with these choices and lose-lose situation. I thought it was very fascinating.
I mean, what's interesting about that generation, and like my mom was friends with Anne Sexton, so I think that some of those people, which is a little bit older generation, and some of those women too. She wasn't friends with Doris Lessing, but she was friends with a lot of women in that generation. And I think my mom certainly struggled with this. There was a sense for these women that they could not have it all.
Yeah.
Now I think we're in a different way, which is we are told that we must have it all, which is it's an equal trap, right?
Yeah.
Because how can you possibly do that? But so I would say I think they really thought that they were sort of that they only had very limited choices, and that they could sort of have these children, but they would have to be, very limited. And now I think we are sort of put, my mother was always like, it's a choice between my work and you.
Yeah.
And for us, I think we, in my generation, I'm 43, it's sort of, in a way, I feel like almost worse. It's like, you must have children, you must have career success, and also you should work out and do this and do that and be happy,
Yes.
and make me time,
Well, what's interesting about the book is it, like Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, it's talking about all these writers. Although some of them are very well known, maybe other than Alice Walker, I guess Toni Morrison also, they almost none of them had any real commercial success. So like they're grinding against these gender stereotypes, but they're also just grinding it out with like sort of subsistence level survival, this sort of starving artist thing. For people who don't know, I mean, your mom's book sold like 20 million copies. It was one of the best-selling books of the entire era. That must have been a different set of issues, because hers are issues of abundance rather than scarcity. Although time is still the best resource.
Alice was super famous, and Toni Morrison too. I mean, like, and Toni was like so famous, but she was also like a professor. I mean, those guys were super famous and successful. Alice is still alive. Toni is dead. But yeah, I mean, her problems, but again, being successful doesn't mean you're not completely neurotic. I mean, there was a sense in which she felt that, she had this big book in 1973, and maybe she would never write again, or maybe the book would never be as good, or maybe she would never be as successful as that one book. It was like her, to have your first book be huge is its own. I mean, look, it's not as bad as not.
Yes.
But I think it creates a whole other level of anxiety.
Well, yeah, you never really feel like you've made it. You never really feel like you're good. And then if you are driven, your drives just expand to want to exceed or beat what you've already done. So it's kind of this treadmill that you get on, that like family can feel like that it's fighting for a finite amount of resources. I think that's the struggle.
And I also think with my mom, she definitely worried that she would, and my grandmother had this too, her mother, where they worried that they would get lulled into parenting too much and that it would somehow take away from their work. Yeah. And so they would always be very anxious that maybe they would do too much parenting and that would somehow
corrupt them.
Right. Or prevent. And the reality is, I mean, my grandmother was a painter, my mother was a writer. They were both so profoundly bad at that kind of connection that didn't come naturally and did not take them over. And the anxiety about it made it even harder.
Yeah, I think that's what's so insidious about it. It's like, because you're very good at your work and your work is natural and your work is something you control, family feels it's not that family takes up a lot of time. It's that family takes you out of your comfort zone because it's all the things that work is not to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I also think like if you get, with that generation, they had sort of figured out that they didn't have to do it. Like my grandmother was like, she sort of went with my grandfather on these trips because he was an import-exporter, and they left the children with her parents, which is very unusual, right, for that generation. I mean, this is 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So, and then my mother had me, 1970s, 80s, and she had just discovered that she could just outsource almost all of it. And so that was like thrilling to her, right? And there was no, this was the early days of like having people take care of your children.
And probably baby formula and a lot of those things are just possible. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was the big shift that I think we don't spend enough time talking about or thinking about, as women especially, is that you had a time when, the pill was the 60s, abortion was the 70s, baby formula, women were not, sort of, they were part, they were sort of baby makers, and then they were, wives.
Yeah.
I mean, there just weren't a ton of other roles for women, and that was sort of set up that way. So it's a bit, it's been a huge transition in some ways. In a lot
Yeah,
of ways.
that it's funny so reading this book, still there's this kind of monstrous selfishness that all artists seem to have,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But like what struck me as sad because obviously when you read about the sort of male counterparts of all these authors, and I think about this generationally, like when I have young kids, and it's like my favorite thing in the world. Like I care about it more than more than anything as effectively, right?
Right.
And you just think, and all my favorite memories are that I would rather do that than go to parties or do all the perks of success. But then when you think like generationally, that fathers willfully deprive themselves of said thing, it's kind of insane when you think about it. Do you know what I mean? Like when you think about how fun
Yeah.
it is to have kids, it's obviously very hard. But when you think about
Right.
all the good parts, and that dads chose, or society chose, that like you just don't get to enjoy all these things, and people were just like, okay, that's how it works.
I mean, I would say like they didn't even know.
Right. Yes.
Like they didn't even know that was an option. I mean, that's the thing that's such a change. Is like, I mean, during the time, there weren't other options. But I do think the thing that's hard is it went from like, you can't do this to you must do this.
Yes.
And you must do everything else too. And I think that's very tough. Like, our parents' generation was like, you can't spend time with your kids. And our generation is like, you must spend a lot of time with your kids and also work and also. And so I think it's a lot. I mean, I think it's good. It's certainly better than the alternative, but it's also, it's meaningful shift.
Yeah, my friend Austin Kleon, his rule is work, family, scene, pick two. And I think people struggle trying to get all three. The scene being, social media, the scene being parties,
right.
The trips, the thing, ironically, that people glamorize and associate a creative profession with.
Right.
The idea that you're probably going to have to say no to those things if you want to actually be a good parent.
Yeah. I mean, I think what being a good parent is when your kids are little versus what being a good parent is when your kids are old is like very different too. I mean, I have an 18-year-old and two 14-year-olds. So like when they were little, it was basically just sit there with them and stare at them. As they've gotten older, like that's been a sort of different a change in what was sort of needed from me. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that is super important. And yeah, I think that's right.
I loved your teenager piece because you were sort of asking this question is like, how do you, and I think it's a philosophical question even, but you're like, how do you tell people it's going to be okay when you increasingly doubt the truth of that statement, which I feel like describes the last couple of years quite tragically, but truthfully.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that, that's like a fundamental question as a parent in general. I mean, you could make the argument that in I'm thinking of like during World War II, there were American Jews watching what was happening in Germany. Could they tell their children it was going to be okay, right? Or, the kids are doing these lockdown, not even lockdown drills. These kids are doing nuclear drills in their schools in the 50s and 60s. Like, could you say it was going to be okay? I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I lived during 9/11. I was in New York. And after 9/11, like, there were two very relevant things that happened. One was that there were these like little earthquake reverberations of like anxiety where people would say like, it's a code yellow. They found there's a truck there's a truck with no license plate on 43rd Street. We're going to shut down the whole city because, right, because we can't find the registration on the truck. So there would be these little earthquakes. But then there was also, and there was a lot of anxiety about that. But then there was also like an actual problem with the toxic fumes from the World Trade Center that was actually poisoning people, and people didn't know it. And lots and lots of people died of cancer because they thought it was safe, and nobody told them. So you had like sort of a non-existent fear and a real fear, and both happening at the same time, and not and no one knew what was happening. So I think it was a very strange time to live in. And so could you say things were going to be okay then? I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's the PTSD of coming out of the pandemic, and we've seen it. The reverberations of like, are murder hornets going to be a thing now?
Right.
Is monkeypox going to be a thing?
Monkeypox, yeah.
For a good chunk of, like, let's call it normal life, stuff happens. It bubbles up. This crazy thing. They're getting reports of this crazy thing. People are speculating about this thing, and the vast majority of the time, nothing comes of it. Right. So then 1 out of 1,000 times, that thing turns into COVID or turns into 9/11. If the thing happens,
right,
then how do you get back to a life where you're not hyper vigilant, right? Because parenting, you're already hyper vigilant. Then things happen in the world, and it exacerbates the hyper vigilance. But you can't sustainably or healthily live in a state of hyper vigilance. So that's the struggle of being a parent and a person in an uncertain, unpredictable world.
Yeah. I mean, I would also add that I think we don't, like, one of the things that we don't talk about enough, which I think about a lot, is like part of why everyone is so in such a bad mood and so angry is because of this. Like, we are in this post-pandemic kind of haze, and people think like, because there's like this sort of rage going on in American life right now, and it's there's school shootings, there's crime, there's clearly, and you saw, and there's reporting today that there's also a lot of rural crime too. So it's not just in urban areas, like it's really everywhere. And part of it is people stuck in their home for a long time and the disruption. But part of it is this, this going back to normal, whatever that means, and the kind of mental, where the sort of, I think the sort of trauma of having lived through this experience, and because even though it wasn't like 1918 and our youngest and healthiest didn't die, we still had, people who were, we still had people die. We still had people get sick. We still had stories of people who were young who died. I mean, there was still a lot of randomness.
No, it's profoundly traumatic, and like trauma makes people behave in strange, unpredictable ways. And then it's kind of a feedback loop, right? It's like when people are acting out because they've undergone trauma, it's very hard to maintain your faith in humanity when you watch people behave or tweet or speak in a certain way. And then it's how do you pull out of that spiral? Or at the very least, how do you not ruin your kids? So they, like, you know what I mean? How do you not ruin them, like make them jaded, cynical, suspicious, etc., without also being dishonest, like you said, like pretending everything's fine when it's profoundly not fine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of like, as a parent, there's a kind of want to fix things and to tell your kids they'll never suffer, and it's a control thing. I don't know that how good that is as like a parent. I feel like it's almost better to let them have some uncertainty about the world. I mean, the problem with, I think, I talk to my 18-year-old about this a lot. The problem with this generation of teenagers is they have seen they've seen my generation, which is like younger than baby boomers. We're like, I'm young Gen X.
Yeah.
So they've seen us really not kill it. And in fact, the thing I always think about is like almost all of the leaders, or many of the leaders of political leaders, are in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And we're all in our 40s and 50s and 30s, and like we're not running anything, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we got Nancy Pelosi, we got Chuck Schumer, we got Mitch McConnell. Like, these people are septuagenarians largely, and there's a sense in which our generation is sort of back a burnered, and then you have people like AOC who are like superstars, but they're in their, she's 32 or 30.
Well, no, it's like they want people to sort of respect the system and the norms,
Right.
as they personally don't respect the system or norms.
Right.
Like, I think,
Yeah.
like, you look at this, she's a hero to many people, but you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like the profound selfishness of her
Right.
choice not to hand it over in earlier, or just assume it will work out as sort of there's almost like an all be gone, you'll be gone attitude to the like, what's that famous quote? After me, the deluge. It's sort of
Right.
like this selfish, like, I'm in power now. I have what I have now. I should hold on to it. The idea that I need to set up an orderly transition, or that there's even some idea of enough. Like, I've gotten mine. Like, I want to make sure that this neighborhood or this system or this company or this industry is on sound, younger footing, not just for the person immediately after me, but many people after me. I think young people have watched a repeated betrayal of that idea.
Well, I mean, it's like the reporting from Rebecca Traister with that piece on Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah.
Where she is like, don't worry, it'll be okay. Like, it's like she doesn't worry because she's very, very elderly and is maybe not 100% there. Again, I can't speak to her mental state, but we've certainly seen things that might make us think that. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how we get, we're stuck with this gerontocracy that is, I don't think they have they are not as committed to the future as they should be, I think.
I wrote this book about Peter Thiel a couple years ago, and he always says things that make you think. He's not always right, but he at least thinks about things interestingly. Yeah. And he said his question was, how much of the Me Too movement was also just a kind of generational backlash against people who should have moved on a long time ago, but were otherwise impossible to push out. And I thought, even if that's not actually what's driving Me Too, the sort of simmering rage against a people who won't move on, there's going to, that energy is going to find an outlet somehow.
Well, that is the baby boomer conundrum, right?
Yes.
Because that is where we're all really mad at them because they're taking over the planet and they won't stop. And like, we want to have our shot now. I mean, that, I think that's pretty clear. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who's not a boomer who's not mad at them.
Yeah.
In some way, shape, or form. With Peter Thiel, so what I would say about Me Too, and then I want to talk about Peter Thiel. This is your podcast. I'll just, I think that what's happened with Me Too is that the backlash has actually been stronger than the original Me Tooing, which is really problematic. I mean, the thing that's good is like behavior has shifted and people don't feel comfortable behaving the same way. The thing that I think is very problematic is that like the narrative of like backlash and these poor men who got, like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, a lot of these people were really behaving just beyond the pale for a long time, and no one ever said, I mean, it just, I mean, I think about, like, there was this Republican candidate for governor, Charles Graper, or Grouper or something, but I think it's called Groper. And, he like groped women in public, in the year. I mean, there were like a ton of eyewitness accounts of him like sliding his hand down a woman's shirt, and, like that kind of thing. It's not okay. Like, it's just not, so I would say, and ultimately a lot of the people, like, for example, Kevin Spacey has numerous accusers, right? Like, they're going to court in the UK as 7, 5. I mean, a big handful of accusers, right? And then so you really do have. I mean, Harvey was a rapist. Like that Annabella Sciorra story, like, he ruined these women's lives forever and ever. So I do think the backlash has really. I mean, that's the other thing, is like there's so much bad faith media, and I mean this as a member of the media, is so you do find that sometimes the response is worse than the actual.
Yeah, no. I think I found that too, because my first book was about media manipulation. So for some reason, it's like every time someone gets canceled, it's like my first book is like on the reading list. Like they read it, and then they all reach out to me. So I like, you could name your Me Too person, and there's a chance that they sent me like a Dark Night of the Soul email, right? And it's weird because it's deeply humanizing to talk to anyone, whether they deserved it or not, right? It'd be the same thing. You talk to someone on trial for a murder they committed. They would be like, fuck, right? Like there's something profound as you're facing severe, life-threatening or life-altering consequences for your actions. That does something to a person, right? Even if you're rich or powerful. So it's it's always weird because you're talking to someone like that you recognize, whose work you've consumed because they were on TV all the time or in sports or whatever. And you sort of feel a human connection to them because they're coming to you at this vulnerable moment. The weird thing is, having had it happen enough times, all their stories are exactly the same, right? And it feels a little bit like a defense attorney for me, like the defense attorney who's like, yeah, all my clients are innocent, right? Like they all have the same. So it's this strange thing where they all feel like this injustice has happened to them, and never is there any awareness about that there was another person on the side of what they're doing, and that there was almost nobody is profiting off doing this. Like they're you know what I mean? So it's the weirdest. I think I have one of the more surreal views on all of it, because I've ended up talking to a handful of all these people. Thankfully, not Harvey Weinstein, but they've reached out, and it's this weird experience where you're like, I'm talking to this person. I hope they don't kill themselves, but they're also obviously guilty. You know what I mean? It's the weirdest thing.
Well, and I mean, I think, I mean, it's such an interesting, the two things that have made baby boomers the most upset have been Me Too, because the idea is like, I do think they feel like, I mean, Charlie Rose, I just read Charlie Rose wants to make a comeback again. First of all, like, they really do, some of these guys really do feel that they are entitled to another, like, bite of the apple. I mean, I am struck by James Patterson's recent comments.
Oh, that rich white men are subject to racism?
It's very hard to be a white male writer. He is probably one of the 4 most successful writers in the world ever, right? He doesn't even write. I mean, I don't know how much of his books are written by him, but there's certainly an argument to be made that not much. And he's mad that he's not that his people are not getting their fair. I mean, it is like the level of brainworms you have to even have that idea and not say it.
But it kind
But
of goes to the travel thing where like, can't you just accept that things are happening and that they're not always exactly how
right,
you would like them to be? And it just is. One of my favorite quotes from Seneca is he says, that taxes are a certainty of life, right? He was saying this
right,
2,000 years ago, but that there's lots of different forms of taxes. And he says, you just
right,
pay the taxes of life gladly. Like there's just
yeah,
and one of the taxes of being one of the four most popular people in the world at what you do is got to be that the world attacks you, the world attacks your friends. You
right,
don't think things are perfect. Like there's a weird amount of arrogance to it where it's like, I don't think this is the way that things should be. And therefore that means this is somehow unjust or a persecution when really it just
right.
is. It's just a
Is
moment
yeah.
in culture. It's a wave.
But I also think that fundamentally, people who have enormous success and make a lot of money are inadvertently or advertently surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear.
Yes.
And that gives them brainworms.
Yeah.
And so when when you interview them, you're not talking to a normal person, you're talking to someone who's never had anyone tell them the truth, or hasn't in 3 decades. And so, I mean, that's, I wrote this piece about Bill Maher and he's super mad at me, which is, God bless. And he, and I said, he's been famous since 1993. He has millions of dollars and he lives in Los Angeles. Like, this is not going to make you a normal person. And I'm very honest about my own situation. I come from a very privileged background. I've been very lucky. I have, had a lot of advantages. But, people still tell me that the sky is blue and that it's raining out, whereas I don't know that people tell that to Bill Maher.
I think that's right. So what's the other? So boomers, it's Me Too, and what's the other one that really upsets them? Is it cancel culture? Or?
I think cancel culture,
Yeah.
because they just are convinced. I think it's an anxiety. I think more than anything, they're just convinced that they will say something wrong and it will ruin their lives. When in fact, in actuality, the people we've seen who that's happened to have been people who were really bad faith actors, like who were saying race, I think of what's her name? The woman who got canceled. She was like Paula Deen.
Yeah.
Like Paula Deen, this was not an accident. Like clearly, she said a lot of really problematic racist stuff. Like, I mean, and she ended up still having, I think she still has some of her empire, but, I don't think you sort of stumble onto this. I think, if you make it, and I mean, a good example is Lizzo, right? She said something that people got offended by. She apologized and she changed it. And I mean, it was like not a big deal. It didn't matter. People were like a little offended. She changed it, apologized. Like it's so, I mean, I feel like, if you are a public person, you make a mistake, like, and you are of good faith and you say you're sorry, like, generally people forgive you. I mean, these situations are more, they were more like real, there was a malicious intent.
Yeah, no, there's this boogeyman that's, and a lot of the people that I know seemed very worked up about the boogeyman. And I guess I get it in the sense that like, I also worry about planes crashing, and like if you're a person who
Right,
has a form of anxiety,
worries. Yeah.
I worry. I guess people are framed for crimes from time to time. Terrible things happen, and I guess there is kind of a low level awareness and a preference that not happen to you. But like when I watch people I know just sort of get radicalized by this like anticipatory fear of cancel culture or Me Too, it makes me wonder what happened inside their brain that this thing that's not only exceedingly unlikely, but is affecting so few actual people, needs to be like not just like a thing that they worry about, but like the thing they go to the barricades about. It seems like the same with political correctness, which I guess these are all kind of the same thing.
I think it's about the same.
Yeah. It's very strange.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it absolutely is. And I think that it is, and it's an anxiety. I don't think it's a reality, if that makes any sense.
No, I think it's like it's also like when they do like Shark Week and then people are or there's like a trend of sharks attacking people, then it
Yes.
like I think it's a little bit like that too. It's this kind of moral panic about a
Right.
thing that it's not that it doesn't exist, but like it's certainly like the idea that like it so exists and it's so such a pressing threat that in
Yeah.
fact every other principle, idea, like ideology should be jettisoned to protect from that thing. That's the weirdest
Right.
part, right? You're like, okay, I belong to this political party my entire life, but now cancel culture is a thing, so I will embrace and be fully sort of MAGAized in
Right.
anticipatory fear of this thing that college students are doing on campus in excess about cultural appropriate. It's always just struck me as like being clearly rooted in something other than what we're actually talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I also think that it's just not, it's not, I mean, like, it's like the drag queen story hour. Is drag queen story hour, are, are people being heard? No. Are people being injured? No. Are people like this immoral panic, right?
Yeah.
People on the right are extremely angry about drag queen story hour. This is not, this is like something you can choose to take your kid to if you want to. You can certainly choose to not. And you have people on the right who are refusing to certify the New Mexico election because they don't believe that the voting machines are real. And you know what I mean? Like, these are not the same things, just because. I think what we've seen, I mean, I'd be curious. So just tell me about Peter Thiel for a
Okay.
minute. So if we had had that ocean world, if we had just let him have the ocean world, we would all be okay today.
Well, so I wrote a book about his plot to destroy Gawker, and
Okay.
I was the only one that he was willing to talk to. But then Nick Denton would also talk to me. So it's kind of I
Wow.
found them both to be fascinating individuals and kind of at their core essence, like the same person. And that may
Yeah.
have actually been what drew them inevitably like a gravitational pull into conflict. It's like it was like the world could only support, in their view, the world could only support one contrarian gay tech mogul, right?
Right.
And even though, of course, they lived on different coasts and a different group,
Right.
whatever, but
Very different.
it
Yeah.
inevitably that it was like the town wasn't big enough for the two of them, and so
Yeah.
I found like my take on Peter was I I didn't necessarily. Well, I felt like Gawker was actually horrible and more horrible than people. I felt like Gawker was horrible for many of the reasons that Trump is horrible: the
Right.
cruelty, the lack of
Right.
adherence to any kind of moral compass, the
Right.
driven
Right.
by
Right.
what the all of that. So I
Yeah.
understood why Peter was doing it. I was also very impressed by the sheer competence of it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Well,
that
I
he
mean,
did it.
yeah. Yeah.
And so I was just more fascinated with like who these two people were and what made them tick, as opposed to having a strong moral judgment over either of them. But then I found that in the subsequent years, Peter has abandoned a lot of
He's
the
gotten
things that make
worse.
that uniquely interesting slash
Yeah.
relatable, if that makes sense.
It's interesting to watch how tech world has gotten weirdly robber baron-esque. I mean, I am married to a VC, so and we've been married for 20 years. So I have always thought, or at least up until about 5 years ago, I thought, well, there are some bad people, but there are a lot of good people, and they
Yeah.
want to fix the problems of the world, and they're going to do it with this and this and this, and their hearts are in the right place, and they're building a better world. And as the years have dragged on, I have really abandoned that good feeling. And and it just seems, and I mean, a great example, like one of the favorite conservative talking points is San Francisco. But how did we get to San Francisco? Tech bros, right? They
Yeah.
drove up the price of the real estate. They decided they didn't, I mean, for example, like where I live in New York City, there are quite a lot of people who are oligarchs like the tech bros, and they have poured money into, I mean, a good example is Michael Bloomberg, right? Michael
Yeah.
Bloomberg is an oligarch. He's incredibly rich. He's made a ton of money, and he spent a lot of money on the Met Museum and the parks and and I mean, when he was mayor, I mean, again, I'm not saying he was good on crime. He was terrible on criminal justice. He was, he basically continued a lot of Rudy Giuliani's really racist policies. But he was very committed to this sort of, putting his money where his mouth was with philanthropy. You don't see that with these tech bros.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like it's like it's all the same drive and ambition and money and power without the restraining sort of cultural code or expectations that would protect against the worst excesses. And I think Elon Musk is an interesting sort of real time example of this. I know you guys tangled with him recently, where you're just sort of like, you have all this money and all this power, but what seems to be motivating you most is like owning people on Twitter, right? Like whereas Bloomberg or one of, let's say, a generation before this, sort of the wealthy people would have thought a lot of this stuff was sort of beneath them, or that they were too busy for it. There's a weird almost humanness to it, but as you become powerful and successful, with that responsibility or with that power should come a certain amount of responsibility and restraint.
I wonder with Musk always how much of his personality is shaped by people liking him. And I mean, I don't know how much that's true with other wealthy people too, but clearly, like some of what's happened with Musk, with his radicalization, is that people on the right just adore him and are so excited to have him. And people on the left are like, you sort of prove that you're, he sort of feels rejected by the Democratic Party and has gone on to so I don't know if this is like, he makes these sort of lame ideological excuses, but ultimately you have to wonder how much of this is just like narcissism and his own desire to be liked and popular.
It's very Shakespearean. All of it is so Shakespearean that even at that level, like when you would have millions or billions of dollars to sway you one way or another, at the end of the day, like humans are driven or repulsed by people, whether people like them, what they think of them, or just these traits that we picked up early on, that we're just like, we're these kind of tragic figures who like can't stop ourselves from going down a certain road.
I also think that with Musk, like the whole family wants to be famous. Like the mother wrote a book and she goes to the Met Gala. Like there's all sorts of layers of like weird kind of, it's not quite like, I feel like you can have criticisms about Bezos, but like he bought the Washington Post. He has expanded it. I mean, there certainly are problems with Amazon, and I think is very tough on, that they need to do the things that are needed when it comes to unions for their workers. But I also think that, there has been, like that, a lot of these people do things that are really meaningful, and Musk is sort of trying to build like a, family brand.
Yeah, it's very strange. Although I guess the left probably underestimates cultural power and what that power means to people, and
Oh
when it
yeah.
is capriciously or unempathetically wielded, it can create certain enemies, right? You could argue
Right.
Trump himself is like almost entirely driven by
by
this.
his hatred of the left. I
Yeah,
mean, I would
I
also,
was going to say by
yeah,
the single joke made at the White
right,
House
by
correspondent,
Obama.
just
Yeah.
that like you can set in motion that even Gawker itself, right? Gawker is ultimately destroyed 10 years after they sort of cruelly, snarkily out some person because they don't stop and think, what would it be like to be that person?
What's interesting about Gawker too is that Gawker was like one of the first places to the way that writers were paid by posts
Yeah.
and the way that the algorithm was juiced. Like they were the early uh, sort of adapters of that, and that the fact that that was then taken out of, put out of business by a tech bro is pretty
Who sat on the
is
board of
something.
Facebook, right? Like,
No, I
um,
know.
there's that Nietzsche quote about like, beware those who fight monsters that you don't become one. I think there's an interesting take that Peter and then the sort of world he becomes absorbed into, Musk also becomes in many ways a lot of the things that he claimed to be trying to destroy in Gawker. Like when you look at a JD Vance or a
Right.
Blake Masters and you look at the media game that they're playing, it's right out of that playbook. It's say
Oh,
crazy, horrible things, don't care about who it's affecting, but understand that even the reaction, the horror to it builds your brand and your recognition. And as long as your tribe isn't alienated by it, you're good.
it's I think a lot about this idea that you have these, you have candidates or senators who were Tim Scott, Democrat, Senator Kennedy, John Kennedy from the great state of Louisiana, Democrat. Like you have people who basically gave up what they believed in to become senators or congresspeople. But it's interesting to me. Then they don't then get in there and say like, okay, now I'll go back to normal. They
Yes.
stay right. Like there's no world in which like JD Vance, if by some possibility he wins, that he then he becomes, he goes back to who the never Trump Republican he was when he wrote for the Atlantic.
Well, you tell yourself that's why you're doing it. But it's like, I
Right.
think it's the other Nietzsche quote, it's a mask that eats at the face, right? Like
Yeah.
eventually you figure out, like once you live by the algorithm, you die by the algorithm. Once you figure out what plays, you then don't go back to a world in which you fight that as a headwind. You know what I mean?
Right. No.
That's the tragedy of it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I think that's 100% right.
So, last question: how, given the horrors of what we're talking about, how do you raise kids that, or how have you thought about this with your family? Like, how do you send them out into the world, if not with hope, with a sense that they have some agency or control and can do good in the world?
So I think I've done a very good job with that because I was able, I don't know why, but I don't know if it was my parents exactly, but I always felt that I could do stuff and that I didn't need to wait for someone to give me permission. One of the worst things that you can do to kids is make them feel that they can't just go and do something, right? That they have to, get a PhD or they have to get a JD or they have to go to college and they can't do stuff until if society has deemed them ready. And I wrote my first book when I was 19, Normal Girl, uh and people were like a little bit mad at me, like how dare you like skip the line.
Yeah, I got the
And
same thing.
yeah, by the way, those people like who knows what happened to them, but like um but I don't think that's right. I think people want to know what young people have to say, and I think that that it's actually quite good. to have those kind of thoughts out there, and that there really is a need. What's great about social media, and what nobody ever says is, everyone's always complaining about social media, and they're so mad at it, and they hate Twitter, and they hate this, and they hate that. And I think Facebook is largely, has done a lot of damage. But I also think that what's great about social media is you don't have to have a PhD from Yale. You don't have to be a writer at the Wall Street Journal. You can be anonymous account 234, and you can grow your follow. If people like what you're going to say, you can put your hand on a rock. There is no barrier to entry. Like when my mom wrote Fear of Flying in 1973, your book got discovered if it got good reviews in the following places. And if it didn't, no one would ever see it.
Right.
And you couldn't, unless you got an op-ed published, no one would ever see your thoughts. And now the world is much more open. So I actually think it's great.
Have you read the Maggie Smith poem "Good Bones"?
Yes.
That's
yes,
yes. I like that idea also. The world is fucking terrible. There's horrible people out there, but like a good realtor, you have to tell your kids there's good bones.
Right. Well, and I also think the world is complicated, but there's opportunity.
Yeah, when she says you can make this place beautiful, that's the idea.
Yeah.
It's ugly,
yeah.
but there are opportunities if you so choose.
Well, it's complicated. I don't know that it's ugly. I think it's complicated, and we haven't helped it get better.
Right.
Yet.
No, we have also been neglectful owners.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they're pretty clear on that.
Well, Molly, thank you. I love your stuff, and
thank you so much for having me. This was great. This is super interesting.